At this time of the year, Guerilla in Irish history, we remember Kilmichael and Tom Barry and his flying column, who on the 28th day of November, as the song goes, defeated the auxiliaries at Leachan, Kilviheel, the Kilmichael ambush. Now, for many people, Tom Barry will be well known. But even if you don't know Tom Barry, I'm going to give you a quick recap. So Tom Barry's fame centres around him being an IRA guerrilla commander. He was the leader of the Kilmichael ambush and other victories over British forces in West Cork during the Tan War, like, for example, Crossbarry. He masterminded the flying column and their techniques of guerrilla warfare, using the landscape around them as their biggest ally, relying on the support of ordinary people of West Cork and ensuring that every battle that they went into a battle where they drew the lines to suit themselves, knowing, of course, that they had an inferior fighting force in terms of number, in terms of resources, and in terms of training. Tom Barry himself took on the likes of Arthur Percival, took on the likes of Montgomery. Subsequently, both of those went on to fame or infamy in the Second World War. In the case of Montgomery, he was the opposite number of Rommel in the battle in North Africa, and Percival had the shame of surrendering Singapore during the Second World War. So Tom Barry and his book Guerilla Days in Ireland are studied in US and British military academies so that they can understand guerrilla warfare and understand insurgencies. But it also inspired liberation movements like, for example, the armed wing of the ANC. It's kind of considered as a Bible of guerrilla warfare. But Guerilla, despite his military reputation and the fame of Kilmichael in particular, Barry's book hides a much deeper revelation about colonialism. In this episode, we're going to look undercover. We're going to go a little bit deeper and a little bit past the pages of Guerilla Days in Ireland and appreciate maybe both Barry's writing itself and an aspect of him that people don't necessarily look into. There's a quote from Tom Barry's book. "Above all, I went because I knew no Irish history and had no national consciousness." You see, before he became a legendary guerrilla leader, Tom Barry was a product of the British education, the British national school system in Ireland. Guerilla, in this episode, we're going to reveal how Barry's, quote, lack of Irishness, quote, wasn't personal, it was as a result of policy. How the 1831 national school system engineered the, quote, happy English child. We're going to reveal how colonial education erases true identity and how 1916 awakened Barry and much of Ireland from this conditioning. Guerilla, you're listening to Undercover Irish, Foil to Oath. This is the podcast where we go undercover into Irish history and beyond. Wherever you're listening in the world, either at home or if you're part of the great Irish story abroad, be géisteacht, siga share and enjoy. A Guerilla, a Reigling. So let's start the Guerilla with Tom Barry. So at the age of 17, Tom Barry enlists in the British Army. His motivations were about adventure, about the gun, about manhood. He was not influenced by Redmondite propaganda or anything like that. He wasn't influenced by Home Rule. In fact, the Irish question didn't really sit with him very much at all. The book Guerilla Days in Ireland, I've read it on numerous occasions, Guerilla. The first time I ever read it, it wasn't me reading it at all. It was my dad reading it to me as a child. And it's an incredible book. It's written in such a brilliant narrative style, using the natural flow of how Tom Barry would have spoke the words. You can literally, the words jump off the page, to use that cliche. And when you're younger, you're taken in by the narrative of the war. You're taken in by Barry's description of how he prepared his column first of all, and how he took the war to the British in occupied West Cork. But when you reread the book and look at other aspects, there are a number of things that jump out. First of all, Barry as a writer is, in my opinion, outstanding. But second of all, there are two very, very interesting aspects which are exposed, one of which we look at on this podcast. It's around colonial education and the product it creates. And secondly is the class element, which is maybe a topic for another day. At the start of Tom Barry's book, he places himself in Mesopotamia, modern-day Iraq. He's wearing a British Army uniform. He's out there for adventure. It's during the First World War. And there's a quote here, it says, "In June 1915, in my 17th year, I had decided to see what this great war was like. I cannot plead I went on the advice of John Redmond or any other politician, that if we fought for the British, we would secure home rule for Ireland. Nor can I say I understood what home rule meant. I was not influenced by this lurid appeal to fight to save Belgium or small nations. I knew nothing about nations, large or small." The quote continues, "I went to the war for no other reason than I wanted to see what war was like, to get a gun, to see new countries, and to feel a grown man." And here's the real kicker in this quote. "Above all, I went because I knew no Irish history and had no national consciousness." And that's a quote from the opening chapter of Tom Barry's autobiography, Guerrilla Days in Ireland. This is amazing, right? It paints this picture of Tom Barry in this case, but it could be any other young Irish man or woman at this point in history who has no idea of Irish history and no national consciousness. So it's my belief, or it's my thesis, that this is a product of the successful implementation of Britain's colonial education system in Ireland as part of a much broader and longer colonisation effort. Essentially, this is exactly what the national school system designed in 1831 was designed to produce. An Irish child whose imagination belonged to the empire. Barry goes on to explain, quote, "I had never been told of Wolfe Tone or Robert Emmet, though I did know all about the kings of England and when they had come to the British throne. I had never heard of the victory over the Sassenach at Benburb, but I could tell the dates of Waterloo and Trafalgar. I did not know of the spread of Christianity throughout Europe by Irish missionaries and scholars, but I did know of the blessings of civilization which Clive and the East India Company had brought to dark and heathen India." So there he is detailing the bias of the education he received in Ireland, but obviously by way of Britain's education system. Thus, he said, "Through the blood sacrifices of the men of 1916, had one Irish youth of 18 been awakened to the Irish nationality. Let it be recorded that those sacrifices were equally necessary to awaken the minds of 90% of the Irish people." In those two kind of extracts there, Tom Barry shows us something very, very unique or very, very important. We can look back and we can study and highlight the educational policies of the colonising force, in this case, the colonial project in Ireland. But rarely do we get a first-person description of their understanding of it. So effectively, what Tom Barry has done there is he has explained exactly the kind of product that education system was designed to achieve. So Comhairle, the national school system of 1831. This was founded by the British government, non-denominational in theory, progressive, or so the propaganda said. Its goals in practice were to replace Irish language on Gaeilge with English, to replace Irish history with British history, to produce compliant, civilised subjects, to remove local culture, memory and identity. Now, there were suppression tools, particularly to do with the language. So you had the bata scóir, which we've touched on in other episodes of this podcast. And this meant that tally marks were attributed to each child for speaking their native language. The goal was occasionally to physically punish the speaking of the mother tongue, but certainly to humiliate the child and to bring about a sense of shame associated with speaking one's own language. It was about humiliation, it was about punishment, and it forced children to police their own speech. There was a morning recitation in many classrooms around Ireland, I should say. So in Mach Unruchtig's book, fantastic book, which I've mentioned before on the podcast, around the Irish language in the north of Ireland, he highlights the fact that in certain classrooms, children were made to recite each morning that they thanked the goodness and grace which has made me a happy English child. Now, can you imagine an Irish child receiving for the first time a state education and each morning having to recite that they were a happy English child? This is particularly jarring when we look back on it now, but this was the norm for a number of generations leading up to Tom Barry's time. Now, Corja, a brief kind of a segue now at this point, because there's a poem, John Montague's poem, A Grafted Tongue, which is worth looking at. And Montague is speaking about his own experience, but he captures in that poem the intergenerational trauma that affects Irish people and indeed other nations who experienced a form of colonisation or colonial education. Like this, he says, an Irish child weeps at school repeating its English. After each mistake, the master gouges another mark on the tally stick hung about its neck. He says, here's another quote, to slur and stumble in shame the altered syllables of your own name. So there you're talking about the naming system being changed. A child slurring and stumbling over their anglicised name at that moment in history when you're passing from Gaelicisation or the naming system Oscailga, into the forced anglicisation, changing of names. And I note just a small thing on that, an interesting one I was reading recently, where the records being held on Irish people for generations obviously were kept by the Irish Civil Service in pay of Britain, basically the British Civil Service in Ireland. And for a number of generations, they used anglicised names for Irish people. So in other words, a person could have been born, registered at birth, married and died, and never ever used their name except for in their mother tongue, Oscailga. So they may have been known as under an Irish name, we'll say. And yet, the records of their life, their birth, their marriage, their death, they're registered under an English name, a name that they never carried in their life, ever. So, again, you see that kind of effective colonisation of the taking of a name, even the taking of someone's identity from them, even if they weren't aware of this. Now, Montague mentions decades later, so here's a quote from that poem. Decades later, a grandchild's speech stumbles over lost syllables of an old order. So he's mentioning there his own stammer and his attempt to regain an Gaeilge. This is something that this poem is worth looking at, and I think it captures amazingly the intergenerational nature of the effects of the 1831 National School Act and subsequent mistakes in education. But the best analysis of Britain's education in Ireland comes from Pádraig Mac Fíris, ironically one of the men who inspired Barry and woke him from his slumber, if you like, because Pádraig Pearse was one of those who led the 1916 rebellion. In fact, he was the person charged with reading the proclamation on the steps of the GPO, the proclamation which blew Tom Barry's mind as he was thousands of miles away in Mesopotamia in a British Army uniform. Pearse wrote a critique of the education system in Ireland at the time called The Murder Machine. And he said a couple of things which are worth looking at. So, on colonial education, he said, quote, "The English have done everything possible to kill the Irish nation, but we still live." So in the mind of Macpheirish, who was an educator himself and who had set up his own schools, he was keeping the Gaeilge alive, the Irish nationhood alive, Irish culture alive, and he was very much aware that there was an attempt through education to kill off the identity of the Gael, the identity of the Irish nation, of Irish history. He described the school system as the murder machine. He said the school, quote, "will kill the soul unless it is the expression of the national soul." So again, we come back to Barry's quote there where he said he had no idea of Irish nationhood. He knew nothing about Irish nationality. And Pearse is saying that if you don't have that expression within education, it will kill the soul. He was talking in The Murder Machine also about the teaching of Irish children foreign narratives, the quote, "A nation that tells its children the history of another country is preparing them for servitude." Now again, that could be interpreted in different ways, but what Pearse is saying there basically is that for generations at that point, Irish children have been going to school in Ireland, but receiving an education from another country. He calls it a kind of an identity theft. He said, let the Irish school be a place where the child learns to be Irish. Now, what The Murder Machine highlights is that there was an active destruction of Irish nationhood through education. And the goal of the education system, as Pearse critiqued it, was to hide from view Irish culture, Irish language, Irish nation, Irish history, to educate just enough people to enter into the civil service in order to keep the civil service of the British occupation going in Ireland, and to have enough people like a young Tom Barry who were that removed from their own cultural and national identity that they were very happy to enter into the service of the British Army or the British Navy or another one of those places where Britain as a colony or Britain as a colonizer required just enough manpower, just enough labour to keep itself going. And crucial in that, in my thesis, was the separation of Irish people from their Irish consciousness. Now back to Tom Barry. So Tom Barry's ignorance, if you like, wasn't his fault. It was the intended outcome of this system. Now, 1916 had an amazing effect on Tom Barry, and not just him. It's just this episode looks at him as an example. Standing in Mesopotamia, modern-day Iraq, in a British Army uniform, he's absolutely blown away by the words he reads from the Irish Proclamation. He's absolutely quizzical, absolutely confused as to what this rebellion is all about. But it's a broader, wider awakening for him and for other people. The 1916 leaders, you see, understood colonial education's purpose, particularly in the case of Pearse Macpheirish. The rising was a cultural revolt as much as a political and a military one. Pearse had built Navenas, St. Enda's, on his own curriculum, his own emancipatory education as he saw it. Now, what about Tom Barry? What about the effect it had on Tom Barry? So, back to his book, right? He says the Great War dragged on. 1917 saw a return from the borders of the Asiatic Russia to Egypt, Palestine, Italy, France, and in 1919 to England. back to Ireland after nearly 4 years' absence. I reached Cork in February 1919. So he's arriving back in Cork just when the seeds that were sown in 1916 are coming to fruition, because in 1918 there had been a massive revolt against conscription, and also in 1918 there had been a general election which saw a separatist parliament essentially elected in Ireland, a mandate for a republic. He says when he got back to West Cork, he read avidly the stories of past history, of Owen Roe, of Patrick Sarsfield, of Wolfe Tone, Robert Emmet, and other patriots who strove to end the British conquest. He says, I read the history of the corpses of the famine, the killing of Irish men without mercy, the burnings, the lootings, the repeated attempts at the complete destruction of a weaker people. So, in this instance, inspired by 1916, Barry recognises the poverty of his own education, and he comes back home and seeks to eradicate that poverty within himself, that lack of connection with his own cultural history. He says, I also read the daily papers, weekly papers, periodicals, and every available Republican sheet. Past numbers told the story of 1916, of the ruthless suppression of the rising, of the executed, the dead, the jailed. Those of 1917 shadowed the gloom of the year after military defeat, while the 1918 issues mirrored rising morale, coming together of a nation to defeat conscription of Irishmen to fight for Britain, and the overwhelming victory at the polls for the Republicans who had pledged themselves to set up a parliament and a government of an independent Irish republic. So, Carja, in this episode, we've looked at Tom Barry's transformation, what his early experiences teach us and show us in first person about the effect of Britain's colonial education system in Ireland, the stripping of names, the stripping of identity, the stripping of cultural things like music, language, speech, writings, and the attempt to cultivate or create Ireland in the image of England. But this, in Tom Barry's situation, thanks to the awakening of 1916, didn't last long. He transformed from being a British soldier in a foreign war, an imperial war, to being an IRA guerrilla leader, leading a campaign of guerrilla warfare supported by the people, using the terrain around him to support him and his troops. He went from knowing Trafalgar to leading at Kilmichael. So every year, Carja, Kilmichael is discussed every November, towards the end of it in particular. Every year we look at Tom Barry's genius as a military commander. We look at his inspiration, I suppose, in terms of the image of him, the iconic image. We remember him as a guerrilla genius. But rarely do we understand him as a product and an example of colonial schooling, which is how he ended up in the service of the British Army in the first place, and later as a refutation of this colonial schooling. So, Carja, in conclusion, in this episode, we look at the legacy of colonial education. It was a system that made Irish children strangers to their own language and their own history for generations. It came on the back of a number of centuries of other colonizational tactics like pushing people from the land. We can talk about Ungurt the Moor in other episodes. But this was a kind of attempted to be, I would imagine, the coffin nail, essentially. John Montague's poem showed us the intergenerational wounds that this caused and can still be seen, I think, throughout Ireland today. Padraig MacPhear's Pearse showed us the philosophical stakes of it through The Murder Machine, and Barry showed us the lived consequences. So, Carja mar uckle scóir, just to think about it. What does it mean for a nation to grow up speaking a different tongue? How does it affect the mindset? And do we still carry parts of that, quote, happy English child, quote, script today? Is it something that we still have in our presence today? Barry's journey from an unawakened schoolboy to Kilmichael commander is a story of Ireland breaking that script. Guerilla, I hope you've enjoyed this episode of Undercover Irish. Couple of notes. First of all, thank you so much to people supporting on the Patreon. It makes a massive difference. I really, really do appreciate it. On that topic of Guerilla, I'm hoping to pivot towards video podcasting at some stage, because some of the podcasts I've planned, I think would be aided by a visual reference or by a video or whatever it might be. So if anyone has any advice on that, I'd be delighted to hear it, to be honest with you. Gurav Mila Mahagut in advance. Secondly, Guerilla, I'm still sporting the Movember moustache or Cromwell Nasauna. So if anyone wants to contribute to that, it's in aid of Doctors Without Borders, who do absolutely fantastic work. And lastly, Guerilla, please do share this podcast if you've enjoyed this. It's a slightly different look at Tom Barry, a slightly different look at Irish history. If you've enjoyed this episode of Guerilla, please do share it with a friend or share on social media. As I've always said, it makes a massive difference and massive advantage, I suppose, to getting the word out. And I really, really appreciate it, Guerilla. And lastly, do follow on Instagram and social media. I'm really excited with some of the episodes we've got coming up, Guerilla, so do stay tuned. But for the moment, Guerilla, Berigi Bua, agus Slán go fóill.